Good to see you, Uday. And
Yeah,
as always, you present and talk a very interesting story around the disruption of the digital revolution in banking. I'm guessing from the last session that there were a few surprises, particularly the lack of adoption, for example, by banks of social media. Were you surprised by some of the things coming out of that session?
Yeah, I think I was particularly surprised that there are banks out there who don't have social media or don't even have a social media strategy or haven't really thought about it. And like I said in the panel, I think it's the context of that is that today people are habituated to use social media as a primary form of engagement with their peer group. And so, particularly the millennials and the Gen Ys, but certainly the millennials, are increasingly don't hang out in the way they used to hang out in a coffee shop they hang out in sort of virtual spaces in social media. And so if you're not going to have a strategy to go and find people where they are habituated to hang out or where they're comfortable interacting with you, and it was interesting to hear that 71% of people would rather see their dentist than go into a bank branch. But the point is, if you bring yourself to people at a place where they're comfortable to interact with you, that's the place to be. And so it was surprising. It was indeed a surprise.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense, but at the same time, a lot of people feel that they don't want banks in their social space because banks are big businesses dealing with money, and it's not really something that should be in that space, is it?
I think it depends on the context, right? So if you're wading in and starting to say, hey, look at my mortgage, that's a very different message to say, hi, we're a bank and we're here to help make your life easier. So if you're buying a house, think of us as a mortgage, or if you're buying a house, here are some tools for you to think about buying a house. Or if you're buying a car, here are some tools, and these are the things you need to think about. And so if you become helpful around people's lifestyles, as opposed to trying to peddle your product in a very in-your-face way, then people start to get habituated to having you there and to actually taking the advice from you. Or indeed, with banks like Fidor that we're involved with, indeed you create a community where people actually exchange ideas amongst themselves around these things, as opposed to having the bank actually becomes a facilitator rather than become a moderator, which is a very different, which are two very different things.
I mean, I think that's the intriguing aspect of what you do at Anthemis, which is you've been putting seed funding and organising seed funding for disruptive new startups like Moven, Simple, Fidor you mentioned, all of which I would call are digital banks. So what is the difference between the digital bank and their use of social media and the new technologies and capabilities compared to the incumbent banks?
So digital banks are typically built on social media. So the starting point is social media. So if you think about probably the best example is Fidor, and Fidor actually looks at it in three tranches, right? So it starts with community. So when you first interact with Fidor, you become a member of the community. Now all that means is you are part of a group of people that can discuss things around finance and financial services and investments and whatever it is, a group of people, your peer group. The second aspect is to become a light customer where you can do some easy transactions like payments, etc. And then there's a full KYC customer where you can run a current account and all the things around the current account. And it's entirely up to you as a customer where you feel comfortable in that continuum and how you interact with the bank. In all these cases, the bank, as I said, acts as a facilitator. So it's not there to tell you or to prescribe certain things. If you ask a question, you actually are asking a question of the community. And the community then gives you the answers around it. And the bank will help to facilitate that, will help to give some answers where it feels it may have some knowledge, but ultimately it's another member of the community.
Okay, so in other words, it's very different to the incumbent traditional bank. Give it 10 or 15 years. Is your view that the incumbent banks will metamorphose, transform into the similar style of the social digital banks like Fidor, or do you think it will be a case that there'll be a whole range of new companies out there doing finance and supporting finance, and the incumbents will still be doing what they're doing today?
No, I think they have to transform, and the reason they have to transform is you have to go where the customer is. So if you don't go where the customer is, then where is your customer, or how are you going to get customers? And this was the point I'd made earlier, which was you have to take a 20-year view of this as a bank, because if in 10, 15, 20 years your most profitable customers are now retiring or dying because people die, and that gap hasn't been filled by an equivalent customer set because they've been picked up by the more digitally savvy banks, then I think you're in trouble because your revenue model starts to look pretty flaky because you haven't actually acquired those customers and you've left that gap in your overall customer profile and the cohorts that you're trying to build. So they have to go to where those customers are, and the only way they can go is to speak the language that those customers speak, which is a language of social media and a language of networking. It is not a language of physical locations where you come in. It is not a one-to-one interaction. That's sort of very yesterday, and indeed, that's the reason that banks don't see people in their branches anymore, because people aren't interested in doing that.
And final question, I mean, you are investing in these new digital social banks that are potentially disruptive. All banks will eventually move to that sort of model. But what actually is happening is that as soon as the new startups become interesting and gain critical mass, they get eaten by the incumbents like BBVA bought Simple. So is that not what we're going to just see, that as these new startups have success, they'll just get acquired?
I think there's a real chance that is going to be the case, and I think that's part of the way that banks are going to have to learn. Now, we say that that's a problem, but actually if you look at Google, and if you look at how Google builds product and acquires knowledge, one of the primary ways that Google builds product and acquires knowledge is by acquisition. But Google's metrics for acquisition aren't always what is the PE ratio of what I'm buying, or what are the earnings, and is this accretive or is this dilutive, or all the typical metrics that Wall Street looks at. Google's metrics are often what is the technology I'm acquiring, and actually the one financial metric they always look at is the cost per engineer, so your price per engineer. So if you're buying something for $100 million and it's 100 engineers, you're paying $1 million an engineer. Now actually you may think that's a lot, but actually the cost of Google hiring a really, really smart engineer isn't that far off those kinds of metrics. And so actually, at least what you start to see is a very healthy ecosystem of early stage companies. Some of them will get acquired, some of them will stay standalone, in much the same way that Facebook had an offer for $1 billion from Yahoo so many years ago and decided not to take it and then became Bohemian. I think you'll have some of those, and I think you'll have some that will get acquired, but ultimately I think that's a very healthy ecosystem to build.
Uday, as always, great insights. Great to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you,
Take
Chris.
care.